Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog. And today we're talking about L. Benjamin Rolsky's Misunderstanding the Right, which came out in the New International at the end of last year. One thing to note, I do have a relationship with the New International. I am on its contributing editorial board. So that's just a little bit of disclosure. I also have a relationship with Strange Matters magazine, not on their editorial board. I maybe write for them and work with them on this show. Sometimes you'll see Strange Matter and specials here on the channel. So those are the two magazines I am affiliated with, roughly. Let's get into this article, though. Misunderstanding the right. A resetting is needed, one that draws our collective attention to networks, media, and instantaneous communication instead of aggressive depictions of the great unwashed. We don't really read anymore. Speak for yourself. But actually, I have to make a special effort to read. I will continue that. We merely consume in an attempt to keep up with the current of the stream. Well, most of us, anyway. It would be easier to hook the feed into ourselves. It would simplify the whole process. No logging in, no nothing. Nothing barring the direct encounter with the divine data of X and its endless feeds of autopsies, analyses, and arguments are shitposts, mostly shitposts, actually. And no, dear God, I do not want to directly upload X into my brain. The presidential election and its less than expected results created another moment of synergy between an event and its mediation to the American people. I don't know why it was less than expected. I mean, the polls had it pretty damn close, and discounting for how the polls have been undercounting Trump voters, it seems to have gone in an expectable way. But of course, people are surprised that polls are not particularly useful, since they the more accurate they are, the more accurate you are just to see a divided electorate within a margin of error. One in which the extravagance of the moment is not met by an equal and opposite force trying to understand it played out over various platforms of social media. The cacophony of analysis produced its own expectations for what took place on November 7th. Democrats had lost the working class. This type of epistemic ecosystem is not conducive to understanding, however, but rather to entertaining. I'm not even sure that's that. I mean, entertainment as existential dread. I guess it is a form of liberal entertainment now, but still. The foundational explanation for Trump's return. The all too expected sequel no one wants to see, but will go to see anyways, because. Well, I mean, I don't think no one wants to see it. At least 51% of the American population wants to see it, but nonetheless. This is the environment of what philosopher Axel Honneth, one of my least favorite Frankfurt School peeps, calls the normalized intellectual. Quote, to the extent an interrogation of what can be said in public is no longer to be expected from intellectuals, social criticism no longer finds its home in the field of intellectual exchange, he argues. Continue quote, a social reservoir for the form of criticism that inquires behind the premise of a publicly accepted problem descriptions and tries to see through their construction is no longer found in the class of intellectuals, or as I like to call them, the blathering commentariat. But that's just me. While Honneth's works echo those of Martin Jay in his magisterial work on the Frankfurt School, asterisk, early work on the Frankfurt School, Honneth aptly captures the limitations of intellectual labor in 2024 as the age of the normalized intellectual. Quote again, if the intellectual of the present depends on moving within the conceptual framework of this kind because he wants to win quick public agreement for his positions, Honneth explains, social criticism must conversely devote itself entirely to skillfully drawing holes in these tried and tested frameworks and tentatively suspending them. AKA, all your simple analyses are too simple and they're probably wrong because they're too simple. Not because they're actually wrong, but because in their simplicity and not dealing with multivariate concerns, they end up giving you a false notion. Now, I am actually a defender of some vulgar things we could look at. People are mad about economics, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to say that all unnuanced answers are completely useless. But a lot of them are, and a lot of them don't really look at the intersections. And I don't mean that in the standard way, but the way in which multiple things happen at once can cause unforeseen results. That's one of the basic concepts behind complexity theory, is interactions that seem obvious can create results that do not seem obvious when they bump into one another. A number of themes have thus far emerged from the onslaught of autopsies composed by writers and scholars far and wide that speak to Hannah's concerns. X, our Twitter, is nothing if not an echo chamber of quick public agreement, usually negative public agreement. It's more like the 15-minute hate factory. But anyway, a record of a given populist public secrets, as Theodore Adorno once wrote about the proverbial culture industry. A record of a populist public secrets, aka what I like to call the social id. Although increasingly, since social media is fragmented into even more echo chamber places, beyond the algorithms, as people leave whole platforms to find whole platforms that comport with their prior worldview, starting with Truth Social, but you can also see it to some degree in Bluesky, etc. One might think that what we have is a social id of given ideological aggregates, which means we don't even have a true social id anymore. But that's neither here nor there. In this sense, social criticism would point out that while the above explanation for Trump's victory, especially those having to do with the working class, are not necessarily wrong, they are most certainly a product of the quick public agreement setting Hanif describes. And honestly, this is Varn talking, I would say the quick public agreement amongst liberals has more to do with race than the working class, but we'll come back to that. Nothing that took place on Tuesday should have been a surprise to anyone paying attention to the ebbs and flows of popular culture in the United States. Agreed. Comedian Tony Hinchcliffe and company sold out Madison Square Garden for multiple nights in this past August. Hard truths did not emerge from the wreckage of the presidential election. They were there all along. The problem is that a collective group, intellectuals, have become beholden to the ecosystem Hanif outlines. Producing content cannot be the driving force behind understanding conservative subjects in the public square. As Gabriel Winat recently argued, Trump, or Trumpism, has literally remade Americans in an image of itself. I'm not sure that's actually true, but we'll have to go back to Winat's article. Maybe I'll do one on it as well. This is something to sit with or to consider seriously. Did working class Americans vote for Trump? What does that actually mean? Well, it means that people who are blue collar voted for Trump. Yes, but so did Archie Bunker and those who want him to be president in the 1970s. Well, Archie Bunker is a fictional character. As I understand it, my task as a historian and social critic, and those two things should not actually be assumed to be the same thing, this is just Varn talking, is to assume the position vis-a-vis society that gives me a certain distance from socially rehearsed interpretive models, aka the ability to look at multivariant, multi-causal things and come up with a sufficiently sophisticated answer, which you often can't do in the moment. Period. I mean, it's going to take time. In this sense, in surveying how American intellectua has written about Trump on two separate but interrelated occasions, very little has changed since the analysis of those trying to understand the rise of Senator Joe McCarthy in the 1950s. As legal scholar Samuel Moen and Riz Rana have recently pointed out. Aziz Rana, excuse me. Riz Rana? Wow. Aziz Rana. Cold War liberalism remains a dominant strain within American public life for a variety of political and cultural reasons. I'm going to actually agree with Danny Besner that Cold War liberalism is the dominant coin of which public intellectuals talk, from Timothy Steiner to Anne Applebaum, but that's not what's making policy these days. What's making policy these days is the different schools of geopolitical realism. But that means that the liberal intellectia is particularly disconnected, not just from the general public and not just from analyzing the general public. It's also disconnected from what policy figures are doing. And it's missing it to talk about it in terms of whatever the blue fuck they think is going on with the presidency. Partly to exacerbate the differences when there's a lot of continuity between these administrations. What has not been pointed out thus far, however, is how scholars, pundits, and commentators remain beholden to its logics when studying the right. I mean, I pointed it out, but also thank you for pointing it out. Good job. This is what Hanif means by the socially rehearsed interpretive models. Those that began and end with Daniel Baer and Richard Hofstadter's The Radical Right, published in 1955, which was actually probably somewhat innovative when it was published, but has become the Cold War liberal standard. But I'm not sure that like policymakers understand the world that way. And I'm not sure the general public understands the world that way. Public intellectia understands the world that way. The writers at the New York Times understand the world that way. But does anybody else? I'm not so sure. And I'm not sure we know either. An anxious minimalist approach reflected the purist assumptions about the public square in its undoing as Bell and others focused their attention on the most radical of conservative subjects. The scholastic interest reflected the Cold War's attention to existential threats to the democratic order, something that has made this Cold War rhetoric really useful for mid-tier, mid-cult, middle class addressing mid-wit intellectuals. Bunch of mids. Right? That's why they painted this as a threat to democracy, because you can talk about things and go back to Hofstadter and Bell and maybe Arthur Schlesinger and the stuff of The Greatest Generation that was being published in the time of the baby boomers. And before, honestly, because 55 is really before the baby boomers. As such, the theories of Hofstadter and Bell function as both an academic intervention and a civic prescription at the same time. Moving forward, we need better, more robust ways of interpolating the right as a subject of critical inquiry, and not only as a source of a popular podcast. That's not a small slight at Sam Adler Bell and Matthew Sitman. Not at all. Winnett points us in the most productive analytical direction when it comes to moving forward and understanding American conservatism. His attention to the ways in which the American people have been interpolated as an entirely different subject speaks to the urgent need to reapply the works of Stuart Hall, the British Marxist who also came up with the analytics of understanding code switching. For those of you who don't know who Stuart Hall is, to America's present socioeconomic and political predicament. As I hope to illustrate in my forthcoming work, the categories and methods of Cold War liberalism still very much alive today in punditry. I'm not sure they are in policy, and I think we need to separate the two. But Rolsky is not talking about policy. He's talking about punditry and our understanding of the public, so he's still being completely fair here. Has utterly failed to understand the clear and present danger of American conservatism by only focusing on its most extreme elements. Bingo! Or if you're in the Marxist world, on its much weird elements. Why am I always asked to cover weird stuff? Because that's what you guys are interested in. It's not actually pertinent to understanding the right, guys. I mean, it's pertinent for understanding part of it, but honestly, the weirder stuff appeals to more hybrid thinkers and niche internet shit than it does to actually understanding who's setting policy or what's really going through policymakers' heads. After quoting Hall at length, Winnett observes, Trump has remade Americans, and to defeat Trumpism requires nothing less than the left doing the same. What the fuck does that mean? We'll have to come back to that. What has become abundantly clear is that whoever is not willing to talk about capitalism should keep quiet about fascism, as Max Horkheimer once remarked. I mean, honestly, people should probably keep quiet about fascism in general, not because there aren't fascistic threats on the rise, but because a lot of the times they are trying to paint this in a historic Cold War mode. Ironically, they're trying to go just before the Cold War, which is the only time liberals, anarchists, and Marxists were ever on the same side, and not even really them, but they can tell themselves that and in the retrospective historiography in the popular public, so that you can have all hands on deck popular frontism, which tends to help the center out more than anybody else. But anyway, for Winat, the analogy is more stark. They're willing to eat the calf, but they dislike the sight of blood. I mean, that's true too. Despite Winat's useful example, however, we still need Hall to lead us the way forward. His work on the rise of Margaret Thatcher in England is arguably the most important work on the subject, not to reach the proverbial shores of American intellectual life. Yeah, I'm gonna second Rolsky here. It's good. Read as much Stuart Hall as you can. You know, I'm always telling you to read more. And actually read. Don't just fucking read a meme or an article. All right, anyway. The purpose of theorizing, Hall once wrote, is not to enhance one's intellectual or academic reputation. Well, Hall, we would love to believe that was not the case, but it often is, particularly once you get into like Deleuzian concept boxes or whatever. But to enable us to grasp, understand, and explain, to produce a more adequate knowledge of the historical role in its process, and thereby to inform our practice so that we may transform it. That's a very fancy way of rephrasing Marx, but that's what he's doing. This means resisting the allure of the already agreed upon assumptions of the normalized intellectual age in favor of asking broader questions about how best to understand American conservatism as a historically contingent subject, rather than a timeless cataclysm, a threat to the democratic order, which also it can't really be because it's a choice in the democratic order. I mean, it might be a threat to it too, but then so might be the liberal administrative state. I mean, you know, none of that's particularly democratic in the small d sense. A resetting is needed, and one that draws our collective attention to networks, media, and instantaneous communication instead of regressive depictions of the great unwashed. America, fuck yeah, shit. I am so tired of that. I was tired of it in the aughts, and it's been going on. I mean, it was going on even before the aughts. They just didn't have that stupid fucking phrase to throw behind it. But I know so many smart people who default to that stuff because it makes them feel smarter. Since labor down to the present has not managed to solve it, Winat remarks, the case is worth serious consideration. Hall helps us understand how normal forms of common sense emerge and are remade to define a given epoch of time, as well as a given group of people, especially if they're all consuming the same content. The latest episode of American public life, the presidential election. And let's be honest, political events are about the only fucking thing we do all share as public content. And we experience it as infotainment. Understanding how the American people have gravitated towards such forces, or better yet, swung towards them, should not come as a surprise or a source of disappointment. Instead, it should be met with a reinvigorated sense of commitment to getting the analysis right, as it were, for the proverbial future. For someone like Antonio Gramsci, the idea was to extend the violently to the things as they are. To this day, this remains the conceptual task in front of us. The question is, are we ready to do it? Well, are you ready to ask harder questions than just like the working class has given up on the Democrats? But why? Who? Which parts? What's the logic? I've been trying to push back on narratives that working class people don't vote in their own interests for forever because it's just not true. Progressives don't actually enact their policy, so they're not voting in their own interest, etc. Now, I do think we have to deal with the fact that Cold War liberalism has poisoned a lot of minds, but I also think we do need to point out that it really isn't what's driving policy. That there is a big gulf between the public discourse, the public intellectual discourse, which is separate but tied into that, and what policymakers actually fucking do, which is a third thing, unrelated to the other two often, although hidden and interpolated by them. We need better understandings. I agree with Rolsky on this. And on that note, we'll end. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. I'd like to thank my Kanel Kohanim level supporters or my sponsor level supporters. I have a new one that I need to give appropriate aplomb to. And so I would like to thank Kay Lindsay. Thank you so much for your support. And on that note, like and subscribe, hit the bell, and protect your peace.